The desert town a dancer refused to let die. The true story of Death Valley Junction, California. And the woman who painted an audience that would never leave. On the far eastern edge of California, where the highways run straight and empty toward the Nevada line, and the desert opens so wide it seems to have no end, there is a single cluster of pale, low buildings standing alone in the dust. There is no town around it, no gas station, no traffic light, no neighborhood, just one long, curving Spanish-style building, a scattering of quiet rooms, and a sky that goes on forever. Most Californians have never been there. Most have never heard its name. It is called Death Valley Junction. It was built by a borax company that needed a place where two railroads could meet. It was abandoned when the railroads died. And then it was brought back from the dead by a single dancer from New York City, who looked through a hole in a locked door and decided that the emptiest place in California was exactly where she wanted to perform. To understand Death Valley Junction, you first have to understand what could possibly bring anyone to this place. It sits in a wide, pale valley on the eastern side of Death Valley itself, one of the hottest, driest places on Earth. In summer, the temperature here climbs past 120 degrees. The land is salt and gravel and creosote brush, ringed by bare mountains that turn gold and violet at dusk. Rain almost never comes. But this desert was never truly empty. It is the ancient homeland of the Timbisha Shoshone, who knew its hidden springs and its seasons, and whose ancestors had lived with this land for thousands of years before anyone came looking for minerals. To the people who had always been here, the valley outsiders called dead was home. What brought the outsiders, in the end, was borax. Borax is a soft white mineral, and in the late 19th century, it became surprisingly valuable. It was used in cleaning products, in soap, and in industrial work, and the deposits buried in and around Death Valley were some of the richest in the world. The problem was never finding the borax. The problem was getting it out. There was a brief and famous era when borax left Death Valley behind teams of 20 mules. Enormous wagons hauled more than 160 miles across open desert, one of the hardest journeys in American mining. The 20-mule teams became legendary, thanks largely to one man, Francis Marion Smith. Known across the country as Borax Smith, the Borax King had bought up the region's borax claims and folded them into his Pacific Coast Borax Company, and then turned the 20-mule team into one of the most famous trademarks in America. But by the early 20th century, Smith had decided the era of the mules was over. He would build railroads instead, and the place where two of those railroads crossed would become a town. In 1907, Smith's new railroad, the Tonopah and Tidewater, pushed north through the valley, and a small stop along the line was given an official name and a post office. The name was Death Valley Junction. But for years, that was nearly all it was. A name, a few scattered buildings, and empty desert in every direction. The town truly began in 1914. That year, the Pacific Coast Borax Company built a second railroad, the Death Valley Railroad. A narrow-gauge line, it ran from the company's mines at Ryan, in the mountains to the west, down to the junction in the valley. Here, the borax could be transferred onto the larger Tonopah and Tidewater line and carried out to the wider world. That is what the name means, quite literally. Death Valley Junction was a junction. It was the point where one railroad met another. It existed for one reason only, to move borax. The trains came down out of the mountains loaded with white mineral. The cargo was transferred, and the trains went out, across the desert toward the markets and the money. For a few years, that was all it was, a railroad crossing in the middle of nowhere. But the company was about to decide that the junction deserved something more. Between 1923 and 1925, the Pacific Coast Borax Company built a real town at Death Valley Junction. And it did not build it slowly, one structure at a time. It built it all at once, as a single planned community. The company hired an architect named Alexander Hamilton McCulloch and asked him for something that must have seemed almost impossible in a place this harsh, something graceful, something that would tell anyone who stepped off the train that this was not a rough mining camp, but a proper company town. McCulloch designed a single, connected complex in the Spanish-colonial revival style. Smooth plastered walls, gentle arches, tile roofs, a long, low building that curved around in a horseshoe shape, wrapped around a central courtyard, glowing pale against the brown desert. And inside that one connected structure was very nearly an entire town. Company offices, a store, a dining room, employee apartments, and a large community hall. At its height, Death Valley Junction was home to around 300 people. For a company town in the middle of one of the driest places on the continent, it was remarkably complete. Workers and their families had somewhere to live, somewhere to eat, somewhere to gather. Children grew up here, in this elegant pale building in the dust, 100 miles from anywhere. And for a short while, this unlikely town seemed like it might actually last. But company towns live or die with the company, and the reasons the company had come here were already beginning to run out. The decline of Death Valley Junction was slow and quiet and almost gentle. There was no fire, no disaster, no dramatic ending. There was simply borax and the economics of borax moving on. By the late 1920s, richer and more accessible borax deposits had been found elsewhere, closer to existing railroads and easier to mine. The Death Valley Railroad, the line that had created the junction, went quiet. Its tracks eventually pulled up and carried away. The larger line through the junction held on a little longer, fading out in the early 1940s. But the purpose of the town was already gone. One by one, the people left. The dining room emptied, the offices shut, the store closed, the trains stopped coming. The grand horseshoe-shaped complex, built so carefully, so deliberately to last, was left to the sun and the wind and the enormous desert silence. By the middle of the 20th century, Death Valley Junction was very nearly a ghost town, a beautiful, elegant building, slowly baking in the desert heat, with almost no one left to see it. The hall where the community had once gathered sat dark and locked, its windows clouded with dust. It could easily have ended there. Most desert towns like this one empty out, fall down, and let the desert take them back. But Death Valley Junction was about to be saved by the last person on Earth anyone would have expected. In 1967, a car broke down near Death Valley Junction. The car belonged to a woman named Marta Becket. She was a dancer, an actress, and a painter from New York City, a working artist who had performed on Broadway and in concert halls, and who was that year traveling through the West, giving her own one-woman dance performances. While she waited for a flat tire to be repaired, she wandered through the nearly abandoned town, and she came to the old community hall, the locked, dark, empty hall. Marta Becket looked through a small hole in the door, into the dusty blackness, and something about that empty room stopped her completely. She did not see a ruin. She did not see a dead town. She saw a stage. Marta Becket arranged to lease the old hall from the town. She gave it a new name, the Amargosa Opera House. Amargosa is a Spanish word meaning bitter, the name long given to this valley for its harsh alkali springs. And in this small, forgotten place, 100 miles from any city, she began to perform. At first, almost no one came. The town was small and impossibly remote. Some nights, she danced for an audience of a dozen people. Some nights, she danced for 2 or 3. And some nights, no one came at all, and she performed her entire program to a completely empty room. For most performers, that would have been the end of it. For Marta Becket, it became the beginning of something extraordinary. If an audience would not come to her, Marta Becket decided, then she would paint one. The idea came from a flood. In the summer of 1968, a flash flood swept through Death Valley Junction and left the opera house buried under a foot of mud. As Marta Becket cleared the muck from the floor, she looked up at the bare, water-stained walls and saw her audience. Over the next 4 years, working alone, she covered the inside walls of the opera house with a permanent crowd. She painted a 16th-century Spanish court, the King and Queen of Spain holding court at the center, surrounded by nobles, musicians, dancers, a bullfighting family, and ladies playing antique instruments, faces in every direction, all turned toward the stage, watching forever. Then she painted the ceiling, a soft sky of clouds and figures arching overhead, a project that took 2 more years. When she was finished, Marta Becket had given herself something no other performer in the world had. She would never again dance to an empty house. Whether 2 people came that night, or 200, or none at all, the Amargosa Opera House was always full. The audience never left. And as the years passed, real audiences began to find her too. Word spread, slowly at first, then steadily, of the dancer in the desert, performing in a hand-painted opera house in an almost abandoned Borax town. Travelers began making the long drive specifically to see it. Newspaper writers and photographers came. Visitors came from across the country, and eventually the world, drawn by one of the strangest and most romantic stories in the American West. And she was not always alone. In 1983, the year her husband left her, Marta spotted the town handyman, a burly man named Tom Willett, dancing with a broom among the arches. She put him on stage. For the next 20 years, Willett was her master of ceremonies and her comic partner, hamming through every show in outrageous wigs and bonnets until his death in 2005. Marta called him her soulmate. Marta Becket performed on that stage in front of her painted audience for more than 40 years. She bought the opera house and the hotel complex around it. She turned a dying company town into a destination. One woman, one flat tire, and one refusal to accept an empty room had brought Death Valley Junction back to life. In 1980, Death Valley Junction was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Formal recognition that this strange, lovely, improbable little town was worth protecting. And today, it is still here. The Amargosa Opera House and Hotel still stands at the heart of Death Valley Junction, the same pale, horseshoe-shaped building McCulloch designed a century ago. The historic hotel still welcomes overnight guests. In simple, quiet rooms, under a night silence, visitors describe as total. The opera house still holds performances on its stage, and Marta Becket's painted audience still watches from the walls, the 16th century court she gave herself, the crowd that never leaves. For travelers, Death Valley Junction sits in a remarkable spot. It is a gateway to Death Valley National Park, a short drive from the heart of the park. You can spend the day among the salt flats, the sand dunes, and the painted canyons of one of America's most dramatic landscapes, and then return, as the sun goes down, to a historic hotel in a town that history very nearly erased. Death Valley Junction is not a ruin. It is a survivor. It is one of the few ghost towns in California that you can still walk through, sleep in, and experience for yourself. A real place, still standing, still open, waiting at the edge of the desert. So Death Valley Junction carries all of this at once: the Timbisha homeland and the white mineral buried beneath it, the mule teams and the Borax King who replaced them with railroads, the slow, quiet emptying when the borax moved on, the flat tire in 1967, the dancer who looked through a hole in a locked door, and the handyman who danced with a broom, and the painted audience on the walls, the court of kings and queens that has been watching an empty stage and a full one for more than half a century. Many people will never visit Death Valley Junction. Many people never knew any of this happened. But now, you know. That's the story of Death Valley Junction, California, and we're just getting started. If this is your first time here at Los California, welcome. Every week, we go deep on the towns, the disasters, the scandals, the forgotten stories, and the hidden history that made California what it is today. Subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and leave a comment below telling us which California city or town you want us to cover next. We'll see you there.